Hi, my name is Netta Barak-Corren. I'm a law professor from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and this is 18 Questions 40 Israeli Thinkers by 1840.
We'll begin where we always do. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
Um, this is a tough moment in Israeli history, perhaps in Jewish history more generally. Many people say it might be true that this is the most foundational and deep crisis that Israel has experienced since its establishment. I think it's very hard to draw these historical comparisons, but it's certainly around there, if not, the biggest crisis Israel has faced. And in many ways, it's not fully surprising. Many countries face existential crises at around this time after establishment. We can also think about the United States in that regard. And it's certainly one that occurs also in the middle of global turmoil, when Western democracies everywhere seem to shift and face political challenges of a different scale than they faced 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and global politics change. And so I think that it's more than everything, it's very uncertain. It's a very uncertain time, and one that certainly makes it clear that we live in a period of immense challenge. And, I grew up in the 90s, and back then it felt that, history moves forward in a linear trajectory. In the past, we have, wars, we have slavery, women didn't have the right to vote. In the future, we have peace agreements, we are moving forward, we have equality, and we have a lot more to reach, but the future is wide open and bright. And I think that it has become increasingly clear in the past 5 years or so, probably since COVID, if not before, that this is not true. We thought diseases, we thought pandemics are a thing of the past, and clearly, we just forgot that they do come back at least once a century. And here we had a major global pandemic, and we forgot that wars tend to follow pandemics. And here we are with first Ukraine and Russia, and now our huge conflict in the Middle East that doesn't make any sign of really ending anytime soon. And we have political turmoil that really threatens the global order, world order, established after the Holocaust and World War II. And so, history is certainly now moving again in ways that we thought that are deep in the past and will not return.
What's the existential crisis that you mentioned Israel's facing now?
Israel has at least three existential crises. And I found myself working on all three of them.
One Jewish
So,
state, three existential crises. That'll be the new
so,
catchphrase.
so I think, I'm probably undercounting here. The first existential crisis is the internal existential crisis, wherein Israel has found itself in an ongoing situation of inability to reconcile social and political disagreement within Israeli society, inability to solve them in a consensual way, or at least fairly legitimately agreeable way among the different factions of Israeli life. And of course, right before the October 7th war broke, you know, what everybody talked about was the constitutional crisis and the social and political crisis that underpinned it. That's crisis number one. And of course, I'm probably grouping together a few variations of this crisis, but I would just name it for brevity, the internal crisis. And then we have the regional crisis, which is the one that animates our and sort of engulfs our entire existence over the past years since October 7th. Israel is fighting, the count changes from time to time, but something like 7 different fronts, not at the same intensity, like 48 and the War of Establishment, but we certainly face very challenging fronts. We have been having war with Hamas in Gaza for almost a year now, and for most of that duration of time, a day after, we're also being having a war with Hezbollah, and we have attacks from Yemen and from Iran and from Iraq and Syria, and this is an existential. It's the closest we've been to existential war in a very very long time, probably since Yom Kippur War, and even though the war has sort of like shifting and reaching new stages, it's by no means close to really ending in a peaceful sort of way. So the regional crisis, which sort of addresses our relations with our neighbors, is also very much alive and kicking. And then we have the international crisis, which is a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis wherein the very legitimacy of Israel as a sort of sovereign nation state of the Jewish people is far from being trivial. And to the extent that it ever was, many things that we took for granted, we can no longer take for granted. I can give one example, though. If most of our audience, lives out of Israel, then that's probably the crisis they know best. But people on campuses, on college campuses, were not chanting two-state solutions. They were chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Or they were chanting, we don't want no two states, we want all of 48. And these chants found incredibly fertile ground among publics and communities and audiences where Israelis had thought that they have strong alliances in and strong friendships, and realized that at least some of these relationships and some of the most fundamental are not as safe and sound as they thought. And so the third crisis is a crisis of international legitimacy. And as I said, at the beginning, I might be undercounting.
What do you think has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in the current war against Hamas?
Israel had a series of, and I guess it's hard to choose among them, very important military successes against Hamas. Israel was able to eradicate a very large portion of Hamas's military capabilities, to essentially eliminate most of the rocket threat coming from Gaza under Hamas and under the other militant groups that acquired military rockets over the years, has been able to free a large proportion of the hostages that were violently taken to Gaza on October 7th, to dismantle and develop a way to dismantle the unprecedented array of underground military tunnels that Hamas had constructed, unprecedented in a global scope in the history of war. So there were many military achievements during that war. Some of them are, diplomatic. For example, the first hostage deal, and partially military, because some of the things that facilitated this deal was the military success. Obviously, Israel has not leveraged these military successes to concrete, widely acknowledged success. both substantively and in terms of how success looks like and is perceived globally and inside Israel and in the region. Of course, probably the most painful point is the continued absence of 101 as we speak hostages. Israeli society is still reeling over not just the atrocities of October 7th, but the continued absence and that we know is accompanied with unimaginable even conditions and torture and sexual violence towards the hostages. This is something that we can't ignore. It might be a challenge that no country had faced in the modern era. So there might be understandable reasons why we haven't been able to solve it, but this cannot be counted as success. This is a hugely lacking area where we still need to do so much in order to find success. And I think strategically, the biggest sort of and there are many things to know, but I think the biggest shortcoming is the fact that Israel hasn't translated the military success to an actual shift in the reality on the ground in Gaza. And what I mean by that is that Hamas, and it's important to remember that, is at least three things. Hamas is an agenda, it's an idea, it's a movement. But over the past 17 years in Gaza, it also became two other things, which is a military and a pretty mighty one in terms of catering exactly to all of Israeli sort of ways of practice and finding the ways to create clever and sophisticated countermeasures to make it very hard for Israel to eliminate it. So a very effective military against Israel. And third, a governing entity, so a government that ruled Gaza. And while Israel was focused on dismantling the military capabilities of Hamas, it did almost nothing to establish a different governing entity for Gaza. And in the absence of this entity, we see essentially a host of events going on the ground that chip away Israeli military success. So, first, we see Hamas trying to reconstitute itself, it has been doing so since day one. But Israel virtually allowed it to do that by coming out, essentially withdrawing from every area that Israeli forces cleaned from Hamas's military activity, battled to success. The next step that the Israeli military did was to evacuate this territory, essentially allowing Hamas militants to come back in and reestablish themselves, at least as government, trying to organize civilian life.
You think Israel should have retained a presence in those areas
For sure.
while the war went? We have a question later on which we can discuss about vision
Mm-hmm.
for after the war, but at least while the war is ongoing, Israel should have maintained
Yeah,
posts or some sort of
Israel should
operations in
have
those areas.
definitely done so, because once it doesn't do that and it sort of leaves Gazans be, what happens naturally is that Hamas tries to reconstitute itself, tries to refine, and it has the ability to reestablish its leverages over the civilians of Gaza. Let us not forget that Hamas was not only or is not only a jihadi nihilist sort of rule, but it's also a tyrant ruler towards the citizens of Gaza. And so its means of quieting dissent are certainly not pleasant.
So very briefly, I'm actually curious because
Mm-hmm.
you had mentioned earlier one of the successes that Israel had done in the war was eliminating, dismantling, debilitating Hamas's military capabilities. You see that, from what you're saying, it sounds as if you see that as right now a temporary success that can easily be subverted if Israel doesn't act properly to make sure that Hamas doesn't fill these empty vacuums.
Yes, and what happens when Israel just let Gaza be is that Hamas uses its ability to reconstitute itself, however weaker than it was, for example, in order to again be the entity in charge of providing aid, providing social services. Hamas is stealing a lot of the humanitarian aid entering into Gaza and then sells it in exorbitant prices to the people of Gaza, manufacturing a lot of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And we also know it happened numerous times that Hamas actively assassinated local Gazan forces that tried to establish some kind of different rule for the inhabitants of Gaza. And those are people that could have formed the new leadership backbone for Gaza. So, you know, going back, you asked me, about successes and failures. The most dramatic strategic failure is that we had absolutely no plan for what we do once we succeed in in fighting Hamas militants and actually eradicating or dismantling their military abilities. And you could have thought, there are lots of plans that could have been out there. It could have been, direct military rule. It could have been collaboration with the international community to establish an interim um, governance mission. Like, this has been done in lots of conflict areas. But the fact that we don't have that and we didn't do that means that Hamas is chipping away at our military success. And almost a year after the war, we still don't have a good answer to the question, what's going to be the day after in Gaza?
So that actually leads well into our next question. How do you think Hamas views the outcome and aftermath of October 7th? Was it a success in their eyes?
I think it's a complicated question. I would not be saying anything new right now if I'd say that the equation of success for established countries versus terror organization is entirely and drastically different. A country has responsibility towards its citizens, towards the international community, even a non democratic country, by the way, and it defines success also in those terms, in terms of whether it was able to provide good outcomes for the political community and has a face, in front of the world. Hamas defines success in terms of survivor. So for Hamas, it's enough to survive. Hamas's own survival is the only important metric for success. Of course, alongside the damage it was able to cause Israel. So in those two metrics, Hamas is currently doing very well. It caused, the October 7th was the most, atrocious day in Israel since its founding. In that sense, Hamas had greater military success than the success of all Arab militaries beforehand. So that's something to take into account. Second, Hamas was also able in those few days to actually occupy Israeli territory. And, we should not forget that essentially Hamas was occupying Israeli kibbutzim and Israeli villages during those first hectic days. Again, something that hadn't happened before. And that's also a precedent that Hamas can now, take credit for. Third, Hamas was able to create a huge legitimacy crisis for Israel globally. Think about that. All over the Western world, where Israel has its most important allies, students along, in college campuses, people in the media industry, in journalism, accuse Israel in horrible things, denounce its legitimacy as a state, unprecedented legal proceeding against Israel, the first time that a proceeding charging genocide against Israel has been started at the International Court of Justice. There are proceedings against Netanyahu personally. It's true also against Sinwar, but against Netanyahu personally and Gallant personally at the International Criminal Court, two different courts in The Hague, now pursuing very grave legal charges against Israel or Israeli leaders. These are all substantial successes for Hamas. And of course, because Hamas has not surrendered, is still fighting, and Israel is at this moment under significant international pressure to just leave and evacuate Gaza. Hamas currently sees a likely scenario where it still remains potent, I'm not sure if governing, but certainly, a force in Gaza in the day after is able to say, I survived, I'm still there, Israel hasn't been able to defeat me. And on the metric of Hamas, this is an important achievement. Um, but of course, it doesn't mean that objectively, that Hamas has won the war in any such case. But it's very important to understand subjectively how it looks from their eyes.
What do you look for in deciding which Knesset party to vote for?
Oh, we're moving into entirely different terrain, huh? um, uh, it's a difficult question. Israeli politics shift so much. We don't have, just two or three parties. We typically have something between 10 and 11. Um, and we don't know how the upcoming elections will look like. People are,
Also, to clarify, not to say you're welcome to say, but you
no,
don't
I'm
not
not.
asked to say
Yeah,
which you would vote for. More so, what are the things you're considering or
I
looking
know.
for?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I know. I understood the question. Um, I think there is a major shift um, brewing now in Israeli politics that we still don't know exactly how it will look like and where it will go, um, and what parties are going to offer in terms of a relationship of trust and agenda to the Israeli public. I know that I personally will prioritize um, political platforms that will offer a serious, thoughtful agenda with respect to the three crises that I outlined. I am saddened to say that currently I don't see anyone, any political party in Israel, really engaging thoughtfully with these crises in the terms of what can we do differently, what should we do, why, a broad read of the geopolitical forces, internal forces, in ways that are even going there. And then if anyone goes there, it's typically not in a thoughtful and compelling way. But I'm hopeful that this will change towards elections.
Which is more important for Israel, Judaism or democracy?
um, I mean, of course, that's a classic question. um, and the classic answer would be that none of them is more important than the other, right? um, I think it's a really interesting question how we define each of them. And so I can answer, with a question, which is, I think the answer really lies in the answer to what is Judaism and what is democracy. And different constituencies in Israel give different answers to both these questions. Some think about, the Jewish aspect of Israel as, the Jewish nationhood. So is Jews as people, not necessarily as a religion. This has been the answer that the founders of Israel really gave to why a Jewish state is needed. Not in order for it to be a religious state, but in order for it to be the refuge of Jews from all over the world, regardless of whether they're religious or not. Um, and in that sense, it's typical, to sort of think that there is not really a lot of tension with democracy because there are many democratic nation states around the world. If we're opting for more religious interpretations of the Jewish component of Israeli life, we could find ourselves into more tension with concepts of democracy. Um, and now I'm shifting to what is democracy really, to concepts of democracy that emphasize the need in separation of church and state, the that emphasize the importance of freedom of religion, including freedom from religion, and the importance of providing equal rights regardless of faith. So all of these things could be in tension depending on. So if you think about both Judaism and democracy as concepts that are certainly not flat, and maybe each of them is like a spectrum, or a mass of different things, where you put the gravity of each concept really determines how much conflict there is ultimately between the two concepts.
We spoke about this very briefly before the interview began, but for those of our listeners who are familiar, you were a very, I'd say, important, or a voice that many people sought out from a lot of the documents that you put out when Israel was undergoing the crisis with judicial reform, judicial overhaul, however people know it. Many understood that to be emblematic of the tension between Judaism and democracy and Israel's identity. Is that how you understood it?
No, actually. And I fully respect this reading, and I understand where it comes from. Um, I am not certain this is the best way to think about this crisis. And of course, because it's not really one crisis, but there are overlapping social, political, and legal sort of aspects of it, I am probably a little bit biased as a law professor to see it genuinely as a legal this as a really deep-seated legal disagreement about Israeli constitutional law
In what
and the
sense?
separation of powers. So I think there are fairly two different concepts of two different views regarding Israeli democracy and what is the appropriate relationship between its three branches. And one view which have had the upper hand in Israeli,
Just to
yeah,
briefly interrupt, you mentioned three branches in Israel.
judiciary,
Yeah.
the Knesset, and the government.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that because I had seen different people kind of frame it that Israel doesn't really have three branches. Are you saying that you do think that there are three strong branches that do have that same checks and balance systems that people are familiar with in the United States?
No. And I myself I wrote about it extensively. Israel has three branches, but it doesn't mean that each of them is independent, as you know, as is accustomed to expect in other countries. In fact, one of the you know really wretched problems of Israeli democracy is this sort of unique structure of three branches that have different interrelations between them, specifically the Knesset and the government, in ways that make none of them really independent from each other. And there are no other checks except the Supreme Court on either the government or the Knesset's power. So, under one view, let me go back to the sort of answer to the question. Under one view of Israeli democracy in the Israeli version of it, because of the internal structure that includes interdependency between the Knesset and the government, means a strong Supreme Court with the ability to invalidate laws of the Knesset, including basic laws, if they threaten the structure of democracy or human rights.
Basic laws being those that are of constitutional, either
Right.
symbolic equivalence or
Right.
constitutional value.
Right, right. How long into history do you want us to go?
Um,
Do you want the
so
definition of a basic law?
that'd be great. I'll tell you, the
Okay.
difficulty we always have is that we ask 18 questions, but each of them could be an episode in themselves.
That's
So
right.
I'm trying
Okay.
to straddle that line.
Okay. So just a sort of the brief primer on so we have laws and we have basic laws. Unlike, other countries, Israel doesn't have a written constitution. A decision that the first Knesset made, the first Knesset was actually elected to form a constitution for Israel. And he decided not to do that, and instead to vest the authority to enact the constitutions chapter by chapter in itself, and as has become expected or accepted to think about that in every following Knesset. And so each Knesset over the years, have typically enacted one or two basic laws that are supposed to be the chapters of Israeli constitution once it is fully formed, and in the meantime have acquired the stature of something which is quasi-constitutional and at a higher status than regular laws. Um, so when we're looking at, one view of what Israeli democracy means, it means, we have a very problematic interdependency between the Knesset and the government. In fact, they're not separate branches of government. It means that the government has a lot of, the cabinet and the executive has a lot of control over the legislator. And as a result, the legislature is not really able to check the power of the executive. Hence, we need a very strong judiciary to be able to check them both. That's one version of democracy that has had, I would say, the upper hand in the legal community over the past 30 years. And then people like, Minister of Justice Yariv Levin, and representing a fairly broad camp in Israeli politics, are saying, no, we have a different version of democracy. Our version of democracy is the Supreme Court had acquired way too much power, had entered political questions that he had never before entertained, had started to really do politics, and as a result, had is at breach of the vested powers of the political branches. And this is wrong. And the Supreme Court should be squeezed back to some extent into its traditional powers. So, I just gave you like the law professor view of what this crisis is about. Now you could add layers and you could say, well, the reason why the reformist sort of camp, the camp that wants to sort of shrink the Supreme Court back into what it was like in the 80s, the reason why they care is because of church and state issues, or because of security issues, issues relating to the Arab-Israeli conflict, or because of and there's also a camp that attributes the intention to Prime Minister Netanyahu personal legal situation. And there, yet others that say this is just a power grab. They want to consolidate their power, like regimes in Hungary and in Poland. From a purely legal perspective, we've had this debate for a very long time.
So I'm holding back my temptation to ask about what's interesting just from your description of it is it almost seems like someone can find interesting comparisons with the United States, which does have a constitution, in terms of people's view that the Supreme
Oh,
Court and
sure.
politics have been meshed.
Sure.
I'm really doing my best koach to hold myself back from that, so I'm going to ask our next question
Okay.
instead.
Okay.
Um, what role should the Israeli government have in religious matters?
The Israeli government. And by government, do you mean the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, all of them?
As most of our listeners hate, I'm going to say however you understand the question.
Okay. So I'm not the first to ask you this
On different
clarifying.
ones, people have asked for clarifications.
Okay. Okay. No, it would be very different, right? A very different answer. If we're looking at government in terms of, the sort of formal, like the civil structure of, of the state, the sovereign state, um, each branch of government and municipal governments, each of them has a role to play. Sometimes this role is just to be as most inclusive as possible. Sometimes it's to actively support. Sometimes the government is needed as an arbitrator between groups that have claims to the same holy site, and you need to actually, make a decision who has the right of passage or the right of access to the site at what times and during what. So there's certainly many roles to play, and the answer would really depend on what kind of branch of government we're talking about.
Should Israel treat its Jewish and non Jewish citizens the same?
In terms of civil rights, for sure. So, Israel has guaranteed, and I really believe it, in terms of concurrent commitment to it. That's what I mean when I say that I really believe it. Israel guaranteed full equal rights to all its citizens upon its founding, regardless of race, religion, and sex. And it also guaranteed other civil and political rights to its citizens, including freedom of religion and education and access to holy sites. And many of these issues have also been enshrined in Israel's basic laws and regular laws. Israel has a very impressive body of anti discrimination laws that, in fact, preceded many of its sort of Western liberal democracy friends around the world. Um, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of disability, in terms of personal status. Israel also protects discrimination, not just on the basis of race and religion, but also on the basis of national origin and ethnicity, and lots of other issues. And I think this is exactly how it should be. The difficult question comes at those sort of features, characteristics, aspects of Israel where Israel wants to emphasize its unique ID as the nation state of the Jewish people. So in certain areas of public life that are mostly, though not always, symbolic. Um, and there, I think that Israel should definitely, be entitled to serve as the only nation state of the Jewish people in the world, including all of those symbolic Jewish manifestations of its identity.
Such as what you're saying in terms of
In terms of public holidays, in
Mhm.
terms of its schedule, in terms of its formal language, in terms of the law of return being the refuge for Jews all over the world, which is a contested issue, um, and in other ways. Um, of course, the devil is in the details often.
What I am curious about as well is in those areas where the national characteristic of citizens of Israel may also come into play. So, as an example, military service, which, naturally, not naturally, but legally differs between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. Where do you see questions like that coming into play in terms of the aspects of civil rights versus more of the national character of the Jewish state?
Well, Israel is one of the few democratic countries around the world that has compulsory military service, which unfortunately, as we have witnessed over the past year, is very much needed, and we will not be able probably to dismantle in anywhere in the near or long term future. Um, and that creates a fairly unique situation. Um, the origin of the sort of broad exemption to the Arab citizens of Israel from military service has been a combination of both an understanding that enforcing the compulsory military draft on the Arab citizens would put them in a very uneasy situation vis a vis their potential relatives in either the Palestinian territories or in other Arab nations. And they might be very uncomfortable or really indeed in a very deep conflict serving in such a way. And that was combined with the realization that if this is the case, then it's actually not in the best interest of Israel, the best secure interest of Israel's security interests, to draft them as soldiers. And so the exemption lingered for a very long time, but there are important groups of Arab identity who serve in Israeli military, who have volunteered to serve, have been, there were different arrangements created for them to serve. The Druze serve, the Bedouins serve, and there are Arab citizens of Israel who choose to serve every year and make excellent contribution. So, as long as this, option is preserved, that mitigates at least some of the tension. Of course, now there are bigger questions because Israel's security needs are apparently much bigger than Israel has estimated over the past decades, and so the army will need more people. That creates a huge question. You haven't yet asked me about that. I don't know if you plan to, about the ultra Orthodox, but also about the Arab citizens of Israel. And there are various models that people talk about for you know everybody serve, but maybe they don't necessarily serve at the same thing, because there are lots of tasks, national tasks, and maybe some people could serve, but serve in positions that would not put them in conflict. So this is professional job, work that needs to be done by both the army and the government and whoever will be responsible for finding the right arrangement for that.
Now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism?
That's a really good question. Um, so Zionism, as I understand it, and again, of course, there are different definitions of it. My definition of Zionism is simple. I look at Zionism as the commitment and idea that Jews should have their own independent nation. And that this nation should be in Israel, in the land of Israel, which, of course, as we all know, was not always a commitment of the Zionist movement. Um, Going back to the third crisis I noted at the beginning, the international crisis of legitimacy, and the second crisis, which is the regional crisis, which is the existential crisis, I think that the premise of the question is, I would disagree with or take issue with it, because Israel is still fighting the Zionist fight for recognition and for existence. Israel has, we thought that, this is beyond us. We thought that this is behind us, but it's not there and nor there. Israel is still in the position to need to defend the existence of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, physically against its enemies, who still, maybe not the same as those that were, who were there at 48, Iran, for example, but who still want to annihilate and eradicate Israel. So the physical fight, the material fight over Zionism is still going on. And in terms of international legitimacy, I think we're actually witnessing a drawback. Um, we're probably in a situation which is inferior to what we've been in 30 years ago. And so we have lots of work to do also on that front. And also in that sense, Zionism still has a role to play. We still have to convince the world that this is important, to have the Zionism as a movement is justified, and that Israel as its creation is justified and important.
Is opposing Zionism inherently anti Semitic?
Under the definition that I provide to Zionism, I think the answer is yes. Because essentially it would mean that only the Jews among all nations are not entitled to have their own state.
For people who would approach that question and say that theoretically, if I, assuming that they believe in nation states and they're a fan of it, they'd say the Jews can have their own state. But let's imagine that there are people, which, we see on college campuses and it's definitely present, who say theoretically it should be good, but it can't come at the expense of the Palestinian people. Is that something that you would then categorize in that same camp as an illegitimate form of opposing Zionism?
Well, I would ask them, what does it mean on the expense of the Palestinian people? Because in 48, the United Nations made the proposal to split the land into two states, one of them Palestinian and one of them Jewish. The land had much fewer inhabitants than it has today. The population was smaller. We know for sure there is place for everybody on this land. Israel accepted the partition plan, and the Arab nations, by then, there was, not a separate Palestinian entity. There were local leaders, of course. But the Arab nations and the local Palestinian leadership rejected the plan. So when we're saying on the expense of the Palestinians, what exactly is it that the speaker implies? because there are ways for everybody to be able to live on this territory if they commit to living in peaceful coexistence. If by, if the notion of on the expense of Palestinians actually means that Palestinians are entitled to fight for Israel's eradication, Israel is um, uh, unable, or Israel is not allowed in moral terms, or to fight back and to exist, and I would again go back to the conclusion that this is anti-Semitic.
Is the IDF the world's most moral army?
I don't know. This is a slogan. I think definitely there are measures that the IDF developed and it put in place that are innovative and have led the forefront um, of doing combat in a more ethical, moral way. And certainly the code of conduct, the ethical code of the IDF, is laudable. And I think the IDF invests a lot of resources and thought and care into being moral, um, and fighting morally, and fighting ethically, including immense efforts not to target civilians, to minimize harm to civilians, and and even when it comes to the combatants of the enemy, to um, to play by the laws of war. The comparative question is, I think, tricky. I mean, how many other armies are currently fighting wars akin to what the IDF is fighting? Um, None. So what is it? I mean, is the comparison group null? Um, if we're looking at history, if we're looking at the fight of the American forces in Iraq, in Afghanistan, um, if we're looking at the statistics, the ratio of civilians to combatants in those wars, we see that Israel fares at least as good, if not better. If that's our metric, then maybe the IDF has a claim for, if we're drawing the comparison, amongst armies that fought very complicated wars against strong armed terror groups that took over large swaths of the territory of a nation where many civilians dwelled. I'm getting very specific now, but if that's our comparison group, I think the IDF is doing very well. And I think this is also the international understanding of those militaries, um, that the IDF has been meeting very high ethical standards. But again, it's hard to draw the comparison. Sometimes it looks like more of a slogan than a comparison. I think what's important is to know that the people in charge are trying their best to do what's right, and to not assume that that means that no mistakes will be made, or that there would not be, you know, all kinds of really unfortunate events coming out of combat every now and then, because unfortunately this is war and it's brutal and we would really want to not have it. But all kinds of things happen in war.
As a law professor and legal scholar, there's obviously a very active conversation in the legal community among academics, at least most prominently, that see it very differently and wouldn't affirm the question most moral army and wouldn't necessarily try and go for more of the nuanced answer that you were presenting, but see Israel among one of the worst or most immoral armies right now. Where do you feel, or why? How do you feel, or what do you think that they are misunderstanding about the IDF?
I would phrase the question a bit differently. I think that some aspects of the criticism against the IDF go back to the sort of host of other questions that you asked me a few moments ago about, Zionism and Israel's legitimacy as a state and so on, some of the criticisms really veer in, that direction because, and those are the criticisms that are, entirely detached from facts that
That they start with that the framework itself is
they start with
defining
they
whether or
start
not.
with a framework that really Israel doesn't really have a right to
Uh-huh.
exist, and so everything that its military does cannot be justified, um, and sort of minimizes or really entirely ignores Israel's really real and imminent security challenges. So I think there's a host of criticism that come from this direction, and we could classify it within the sort of the broad scope of what we talked about earlier. Um, there is, I think, a more interesting from a sociological perspective camp, which is a camp that does not necessarily view Israel as a political project as illegitimate, but takes a lot of issue with the outcomes of the Israeli military campaign, specifically in Gaza now and previous campaigns also. Um, and the argument made by prominent members of this camp is probably pretty much along the following lines. Um, you know, sure, Israel has a right to defend itself, but the means it chooses to do so are illegitimate. Israel doesn't take enough precautions to avoid harming civilians. There are simply way too many civilians that get killed as a result of Israeli military action. Israel weighs the lives of its citizens much higher than the lives of the citizens, of the innocent citizens of the Palestinians. Um, and this is immoral. That's, I think that's how I would put it in a very, sort of crude terms. And I think what's interesting about this camp is that, you know, often, almost always, this camp doesn't bother itself with a question: what would you do if you would face the kind of threat that Israel faces as a nation? So, you know, assuming we agree, and I certainly agree that an army should avoid to the best of its ability harming civilians, and it certainly must never target civilians. Um, what do we do when the enemy military is deliberately hiding behind civilians and shooting at you from civilian shelter? Um, and strikingly, the camp among the international community, among international law professors that levers these accusations against the IDF, typically either doesn't ask the question or doesn't have a really good answer to it. The most common answer would be, well, the fact that Hamas is doing that doesn't mean that these become legitimate targets. But that still doesn't answer the question. So what are you supposed to do? Just sit back and let those rockets and missiles and terror and rapists and incinerators, all that come at you, right? I mean, what should you do? And I think sociologically, there is this growing sentiment that just war is bad. We don't want no war. And the zero sensitivity, zero, not sensitivity, 100% sensitivity, but zero tolerance for any sort of civilian damage in war. Um, and, you know, nobody likes war. But going back to what I said, really, I think in response to the first question you gave me, that vision of the world as one in which wars are in the past and the future is one of peace, that has shattered, in front of our eyes over and over again. And war is essential if you are fighting for a just outcome. Um, Unfortunately, sometimes the other party has no appetite for diplomacy, has no appetite for compromise, and is seeking war. And then even peace seeking nations would need to engage in war, and they would need to engage in war effectively. I think that sociologically there are growing parts of the elite um, in liberal democracies that have come to think that the world can do without war. Of course, as a as a normative argument, I certainly agree with it. But as a practical one, it's it's just divorced from reality. But the fact that they're so committed to the idea of pacifism and the notion that war is really bad and nothing justifies certain outcomes, they have really lost connection with the fact that we have no choice but to fight these wars, and fighting wars come with damage to civilians, even if one is doing the best they can to avoid it. It's a very uneasy truth, but one that we must really face, especially if we want to minimize this harm. If I would make the case for Israel,
Where would you begin?
um, depends on the audience. Depends on the audience. Um, I think ultimately, the most basic case for Israel begins with Zionism, with the right of Jews as all nations, especially in light of the history long before the Holocaust of Jews to be persecuted and exiled from place after place to have their own nation. Um, and and there is a long history to the Jewish existence in this place, but I would not end the case there. I think Israel has had incredible commitment and determination over the years to contribute to global welfare and development and progress over the years of its existence, and it still does. And I think Israel does not only have the right to exist like all other nations, but has much to offer the world. Um, some of this is maybe my wishful thinking at this stage, but I do believe it. I do believe that there is so much positive energy and commitment and willingness of people in Israel to invest their time and resources to solve global problems, minding really much more than the plight of Israel, even now, that I believe in the potential that Israel holds for the future of the world more generally. And I just hope that we will have the conditions to let this potential come to fruition.
Can questioning the actions of Israel's government and army, even in the context of this war, be a valid form of love and patriotism?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. It's not the case that every action of Israeli military or Israeli government, is out there in the clouds of, you know, beyond any criticism. I personally criticize many such decisions. I think it's perfectly legitimate for both Zionists and non Zionists to question Israeli policy actions, the military actions. I think the best response to criticism is to engage in conversation. So if there is a defense for the action, it should be, put out there. And if there is none, we should take responsibility and amend.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism leveled against Israel today?
Um, I'm going to understand the question as directed against Israel as a state. And, because there are lots of other ways to understand the question. Um, I would say that there is a very legitimate criticism against Israel today that it has not done enough to promote a responsible, workable um, plan for Gaza after the war. And it wouldn't be fair to say that it hadn't done anything. I think there's lots of work being done. But there are certain things that Israeli leadership should have said and done in order to be in a much sort of better stage as than we are currently. And some of these things should have been, engaging in much better diplomacy, giving sort of real answers to concerns of partners around the world, to concerns of the region, um, handling some of the crises on the ground in Gaza, humanitarian, for example, much better than it did. Um, there's lots of effort invested in all of those fronts. In, if we're judging them by the metric of outcomes, not efforts, then I think there is a legitimate criticism against Israel. It wouldn't be fair to say that Israel has not minded those issues, but that it hasn't delivered a good enough outcome.
Do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
I am not committing myself to predictions. Let me tell you a story. So, in you know just a few years before the Civil War in the United States, one of the most major newspapers in Chicago came out with the headline, "We will not see the end of slavery in our lifetime." Um, right before, World War One began, people were sitting in coffee shops and never knowing that the world is going to go to hell, just the next day. Right before October 7th, we had no idea. We, in terms of Israeli, civilians, had no idea that this is coming. Um, I think we have such a huge shortage of imagination as humans in making those predictions that I think it's more unwise than wise to commit ourselves to deterministic, views of the future. I think the answer to these, to the questions that matter is that, we should have a vision and work towards it and try to do the best we can in terms of alliances, in terms of our own efforts in order to bring this vision to fruition. Um, there is luck, there are intervening factors, or, force majeures, lots of things could happen. We don't have, I don't think it's wise to look at the future and say, we will not see this in our lifetime and have the dosage of despair that comes with it. So I refuse to play this game.
As someone who's so deeply involved with the issues that Israel faces today and of tomorrow and teaching issues of the past as well, what's that like for you to not be engaging in those types of imaginations as you described for the future or predictions of what you think Israel will face or what will happen with Israel?
I think we should definitely take into account serious, assessments of the future. So, for example, when people are talking about, different projections in terms of democracy, in terms of the economy, in terms of education, in Israel, I think we should definitely take them seriously. But I think what we should say, is that we are going to work for, peace within our lifetime, and we are going to work for the endurance of the Zionist project during our lifetime, and we are going to work for a host of important global issues within our lifetime, and not bother ourselves with, you know, the possibility that our efforts will mature or will ripen, because that is where I think we have absolutely no ability to really predict the future.
What do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian Israeli conflict after the war?
I hope that Gaza will see a day when it is no longer ruled by Hamas, not just in terms of symbols, but also in practical terms, that it will have a government, an interim government, and then a permanent government that is actually attuned to both the needs of the citizens of Gaza and to peaceful coexistence alongside Israel. I think there are ways to work towards this goal. I personally worked on such a plan with a few co-authors, and we proposed such plan first to Israeli government and security
Is that plan
forces.
available online, or that's
It
something that?
is. It is available online now. It's available online in the website of the Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University, and I think in other places maybe as well. And we have talked about it extensively. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I want, you know, dedicated to explaining the plan. But I think there are realistic measures that we can take in order to build effective and nonviolent institutions in Gaza. It's a huge question whether Israel is up for what it takes. It's a huge question whether the international community is really willing to invest in making this happen. But there are very practical steps that can be taken tomorrow, could have taken a few months ago, in order to bring this reality closer to actually materialize.
As you mentioned, we're short on time, but I know that in the document there's a lot of discussion about Germany and Japan and Israel engaged in some sort of coalition with, Arab states, international community as well, to kind of help bring about that vision that you were describing for Gaza. Do you see that? Do you see that plan or that direction is where the Israeli government's moving forward, or you think that it's been something that's gotten attention, but unfortunately it's not being implemented as you'd like to see?
I don't know. Contrary to what some people think, I am, none of us, none of the people who authored this, me myself, were not, part of these discussions. We're not making the decisions. I think there is, in general, movement towards working seriously on this plan, but based on the little I know and just what goes on the ground, I would say that Israel is not really nearing you know a meaningful implementation of this plan as of today. All I can say is that I hope that whether it's this government or the next government, there would be serious engagement with those basic questions underlying our plan. How to really, how can we really set something that would work, and not just be, our wishful thinking for peace or for quiet in the day after. And then, it doesn't have to be. It could be the case that by that time, the other steps would need to be taken that we didn't write about. Every plan is good for the moment, that it's adopted. If reality shifts, if conditions shift, maybe our plan would not be no longer be feasible. But the questions and the answers to them, the methodology to answering them, this is what I hope that we will see more. And I don't know if that's happening or not.
Do you think Israel is properly handling the Iranian threat?
That's a tough one. Again, I think I hope that everyone who you bring to answer this question would start by saying there is so much we don't know, and you know I am not in the position to give answers, as I'm not privy to everything that Israel is doing. And so, based on the very little that is evident to us, um, I would say that I hope Israel is doing more than what we see. But I really have no doubt that it is doing more than what I see. So,
Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have friends on the other side?
yes. And I think that Israel's political spectrum is really shifting and unstable. I am still committed to liberalism, peace, democracy, human rights. And so oftentimes it's true also everywhere around the world, the party that people vote to is more of a tribe than like a real ideology. And many people in Israel are shifting, you know, from the left to the center to the moderate right to the center and sometimes to the left. Um, I think what's confusing in this moment in Israeli politics is that what we really need is parties that and leaders that really answer the tough questions of our existence, that intersect the classic sort of traditional definitions of right and left. I don't see them these days on neither camp. I know that, my personal vote would go based on the answer to this question, not based on whether somebody's identified or affiliated with like the traditional brand of left and right. So currently, I'm really looking for substantive answers, not for labels.
And on the religious spectrum, where do you fall?
So I'm I'm traditional secular. I'm very much Jewish. I'm secular in the sort of ways that we live, but we value Shabbat and Shishi and the holidays, and we have lots of both curiosity and interest and engagement with Jewish culture and texts. So not not in any very defined identity, but somewhere on that spectrum.
Okay, and our last question, the end of the 18. Do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
Um, hope, hope, and fear. They're intertwined. Oh, that's probably part of Jewish existence, sort of existential state. I think it's a moment of great fear. And I think I am very committed to the project of hope. And it's a choice. Not always, but if you can make it a choice, whether it's hope or fear, then I think you should choose hope. I feel that personally, I am willing to make it a choice, and so I'm choosing hope.
Okay, amazing. Netta Barak-Corren, thank you so much for answering our
You're
18
welcome.
questions.
Thank you very much.